Some of the most powerful love stories do not begin with a confession or a kiss. They begin with waiting, with distance, with feelings left unspoken, because speaking them feels too dangerous. Out here, in the wide and unforgiving American West, silence often lasts longer than words. People learn to live beside one another, to work the land, to carry their longing quietly. And sometimes, love grows not in moments, but in years. This is one of those stories. If you're drawn to slow burn romances, quiet strength, and emotional stories shaped by time and place, consider subscribing to Wild Sky Stories. New emotional tales are shared here every day. Stories meant to be listened to, felt, and remembered. Now let's go back to Montana, 1897, where a single stretch of land, a broken boundary, and two guarded hearts are about to change everything. The valley had been quiet for so long that the silence felt permanent, as if it had settled into the soil alongside the roots of grass and the bones of old fence posts. It was late autumn, the kind that arrived without drama but stayed with stubborn resolve. The hills wore muted colors, and the sky seemed lower than usual, pressing down on the land and everything that lived on it. John Reed had worked this ranch for most of his adult life. He had taken it over when responsibility outweighed ambition, and over the years the place had shaped him into something steady and reserved. His days followed a rhythm carved by habit rather than desire. He rose before the sun, checked his cattle, repaired what time and weather had damaged, and ended each evening with the quiet satisfaction of having endured another day. He did not complain. He did not expect more. Across the fence line lay Grace Dawson's land. It had once belonged to her father, then almost to no one at all. When she returned to claim it, the ranch had been worn thin by neglect and debt. She stayed anyway. What began as obligation turned into something deeper, something she could not name but felt every morning when her boots hit the ground. She learned the work quickly, not because it came easily, but because failure was not an option. They existed beside each other without truly meeting. John saw signs of her life the way one noticed distant weather, a light in the window long after dark, fresh tracks cutting across frost-covered ground, smoke rising steady and controlled from the chimney. Grace noticed his presence in much the same way. A rider moving along the far ridge, cattle grazing close to the fence, repairs done cleanly, efficiently, without ornament. Between them stood the fence, old wire stretched tight between weathered posts, some leaning more from habit than damage. It marked the boundary clearly enough, though the land itself did not seem to care. Wind crossed it freely, snow ignored it entirely.
Near the center of that boundary stood an aging windmill. Its blades turned slowly when the wind allowed, groaning in protest during storms, resting in long stretches of stillness. Neither ranch claimed it outright. It had been there before both of them, and would likely remain after. It became a shared point of reference, a silent witness to years of quiet distance. When the first snow fell earlier than expected, it revealed a weakness neither could ignore. A section of fence sagged under the weight, wire loosening, posts shifting in the frozen ground. John noticed it late in the afternoon, marked the damage, and planned to return in the morning. Grace saw the same break at dawn, her stomach tightening as she imagined cattle wandering where they should not be. Neither crossed the line that day. Pride held firm, so did habit. But the land had already begun to undo what distance had built.
Winter arrived with purpose, not violence. Snow fell steadily, layering the valley in white until familiar shapes softened and distances blurred. The work changed, growing heavier and slower. Every task demanded more effort, more time, more patience. John adjusted his routine without complaint. He checked the fence more often, especially near the damaged section. He reinforced what he could from his side, driving posts deeper where the ground allowed, tightening wire until his hands burned with cold. He did not cross the boundary. He told himself it was enough. Grace fought the season with the same determination. Supplies ran low faster than she liked. Repairs that could wait in summer became urgent now. She learned quickly which problems demanded immediate attention and which could be endured a little longer. The fence was not one she could ignore. One morning, she found a young calf wandering near her barn, confused and shivering. It did not belong to her. She guided it back toward the boundary, securing it as best she could, knowing the fix was temporary. The incident stayed with her longer than it should have. The windmill creaked overhead as storms passed through, its sound carrying farther in the still winter air. It became a reminder of proximity rather than separation. Both of them saw it daily from their windows, its slow movement marking time when days felt indistinguishable. They did not speak, they did not meet, yet awareness grew, subtle and persistent. Each knew the other was watching the same weather, fighting the same cold, carrying similar burdens. The fence continued to weaken, not dramatically, but steadily. Snow pressed down, the ground shifted. What had once held firm through years of neglect now showed the cost of distance. By the time the first real storm threatened the valley, the problem could no longer be delayed. Winter still lingered in the valley, cold and quiet, but its hold was slowly loosening. Snow clung to shaded spots, frost glazed the fence posts, and the land seemed to hold its breath. John moved along his side of the boundary, checking the fence and shoving ice from the posts, aware of every shift in the ground. Each step felt deliberate, measured, as if the land itself watched him. He noticed Grace's property across the line, her movements precise, her repairs careful. Their connection was silent but growing, built on observation and respect rather than words. Grace moved through her days with focus, tending to minor storm damage and attending to her animals. Doors, windows, and roof shingles demanded attention, and she handled each with steady hands, the quiet discipline of someone accustomed to managing alone. But she too was noticing the land differently. The fence no longer felt like a barrier, merely a marker of shared effort. Small gestures, a wagon of supplies left by John, a repaired trough, passed without acknowledgement, but they were noticed and appreciated. The rhythm of daily work became a dialogue of its own. John reinforced posts and gates, while Grace mended boards and cleared snow from paths. The valley responded to their care. Animals moved more freely, the creek flowed steady and clear, and the cold seemed less oppressive. Each act, small on its own, built a sense of reliability and trust. The fence shifted in meaning, from line of separation to symbol of proximity. Evenings carried a subtle comfort. John lingered by the boundary after his work, noting the glow from Grace's cabin. She settled by her hearth, aware of the wagon he left near the fence, recognizing the thought behind it. They did not speak, yet the quiet presence of another person transformed the isolation they had both carried. The The valley's stillness, the soft winds, and the distant calls of wildlife became the backdrop for a growing understanding. By the time the last pockets of snow melted, the land had shifted with the season, and so had they. Grass emerged, timid and green, water ran clear, and the fence stood steady, no longer a line of division, but a shared boundary. The work they had done, the care they had invested, had begun to reshape not only the land, but their relationship. Distance remained, but the valley, patient and observant, had witnessed the first quiet threads of connection weaving between them. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in softened mornings and longer evenings, in the slow retreat of snow from the shadowed edges of the valley. The land shed winter reluctantly, revealing mud, broken grass, and the dull brown of fields that had endured too much cold for too long. It was a season of exposure when everything hidden was forced into view. For John, spring meant repairs. Winter always left marks behind, and this year had been harsher than most. Fences leaned where snow had piled too high, gates dragged against the ground. The windmill, old and dependable, groaned more often now, its turning uneven, its rhythm strained. He had noticed it weeks earlier, but chose not to act, believing it would hold a little longer, as it always had. Grace noticed the windmill too. From her side of the fence, she watched its blades slow, then stall, then lurch back into motion when the wind strengthened. Water was life out here, more valuable than comfort, more urgent than pride. When the windmill finally stopped turning altogether, the silence it left behind felt louder than the storms that had preceded it. The failure did not come with drama. There was no sudden collapse, no violent break. One morning, the blades simply remained still, locked in place despite the steady breeze moving through the valley. The well pump stood idle. The troughs began to empty.
John saw it first and felt the weight of the problem settle into his chest. Fixing the windmill would take time, tools, and help. It was work meant for 2, maybe 3 men. He stood beneath it longer than necessary, looking up at the frozen blades, measuring the risk, the effort, the unspoken choice before him. Grace crossed the field later that afternoon, stopping at the fence line without hesitation. The distance between them felt different now, shaped by shared labor rather than uncertainty. The fence no longer marked separation alone. It marked history. They worked without ceremony. John brought tools, Grace brought rope, oil, and steady hands. The climb was dangerous, the ladder worn smooth by years of use. John took the height, gripping rusted metal as he worked the mechanism free. Grace stayed below, anchoring lines, watching for signs of failure, ready to react without being told. The wind cut through them both, cold enough to remind them that winter had not fully surrendered. Metal burned the skin, muscles ached. More than once, John nearly lost his grip when the blade shifted unexpectedly. Each time, Grace held firm, keeping tension on the rope, keeping him steady. The repair took hours. The work stripped away thought, reduced everything to motion and balance and trust. When the blades finally turned again, slow at first, then steady, the sound filled the valley with something close to relief. Water flowed. Life resumed its quiet course. They rested beneath the windmill afterward, sitting in the dirt without concern for appearances. The sun dipped low, warming their faces. The moment carried no triumph, only a shared understanding that something essential had changed. John realized then that cooperation no longer felt like surrender. It felt necessary, natural. The land did not reward isolation. It demanded connection,
even when pride resisted. Grace understood it too. She had spent years believing that survival meant standing alone, that accepting help weakened her claim to the land. But the windmill turning above them told a different story. Strength could be shared without being diminished. They rose eventually, returning to their separate paths, but the space between them felt altered. The fence remained, the boundary unchanged, yet its meaning shifted once more. It no longer stood as a barrier against loss. It stood as proof that two lives could run parallel without colliding, without retreating. The valley watched in silence, patient as ever. The land had seen countless seasons, countless lives rise and fade within its reach. It allowed space for something new to take root, something built not from urgency or fear, but from time, effort, and the quiet decision to keep going together, even when no words were spoken. Repairing the windmill took more than a single day. It became a process measured in small decisions and careful movements. Parts were salvaged from old storage sheds, wood was replaced where rot had crept in unnoticed, metal joints were cleaned and oiled by hand. The work demanded patience more than strength. Each adjustment built on the last. Progress revealed not through speed, but through consistency. They fell into a rhythm without planning it. Mornings began early, before the sun climbed high enough to warm the valley. The air still carried a chill, sharp and clean, and the grass bent beneath their boots, heavy with dew. John worked the higher mechanisms, climbing where balance mattered more than comfort. Grace stayed grounded, steadying supports, sorting parts, preparing what would be needed next. There was no need to explain tasks. Each seemed to anticipate the other's movement before it happened. With each passing hour, the quiet understanding between them deepened. The fence remained, unchanged in form, but its meaning continued to shift. It no longer marked separation so much as proximity. It stood between two lives that had begun to lean toward one another, without urgency or expectation. The valley responded to the season as if nothing else mattered. Grass grew thick and resilient, pushing through soil that had endured months of frost. Animals moved more freely now, no longer huddled against the cold. The creek ran fuller, carrying melted snow toward distant lowlands. The air carried warmth instead of warning, promising growth rather than survival. John felt a balance he had not expected. For years, the land had felt like a responsibility that demanded everything and offered little in return. Now it felt different, less like a burden and more like something shared, even without words to define it. The long hours no longer pressed against him with the same weight. The silence felt companionable rather than empty. Grace felt herself settling in a way she never had before. She had believed strength came from standing alone, from never asking more than the land could provide. But working beside John reshaped that belief. Strength, she learned, could come from trust built slowly and without demand, from showing up each day and allowing effort to be shared. By the end of the week, the windmill turned again with a steady rhythm. Its blades cut through the air without strain, catching the breeze and releasing it in measured motion. Water flowed reliably once more, filling troughs and channels as it had for years. The structure marked time without complaint, indifferent to the past struggles that had brought it to this moment. What had begun as necessity had become something quieter and more durable, not a promise spoken aloud, but an understanding held between them, shaped by work and time and the land itself. And though neither named it, Both sensed that something irreversible had taken root.
The valley no longer felt divided by lines drawn in the dirt or posts set years ago for practical reasons. By the time summer settled fully into the land, the fence had become background, something neither of them consciously measured their days against. What mattered now was rhythm, the steady cycle of work, rest, and shared responsibility shaped the weeks in ways that felt natural rather than forced. John moved through his days with a sense of quiet certainty. The land responded to him differently than it had before. Tasks that once felt heavy now carried purpose beyond survival. He noticed how the mornings felt less empty, how the evenings no longer pressed down with the same weight of silence. Even when Grace was not in sight, her presence lingered in the routines they had built side by side. The valley felt inhabited in a deeper way, as if it recognized what had taken root there. Grace felt it too, though she never would have named it aloud. The ranch no longer felt like something she defended alone. Strength no longer came from enduring without help, but from knowing when help existed without being demanded. She worked with steadier hands, slept with fewer restless nights, and found herself thinking less about loss and more about what remained. The land had not changed its nature, but her place within it had shifted.
Late one evening, the wind picked up just enough to set the windmill turning again. Its familiar rhythm cut through the stillness, slow and reliable. The sound carried across both properties, threading them together without effort. It marked time, not in urgency, but in continuity. The land accepted what they had built without ceremony. As summer deepened, shared work turned into shared time. Repairs led to planning. Planning led to long hours spent moving across the valley, with the ease of people no longer measuring distance between them. The fence still stood, weathered and quiet, but it no longer defined where one life ended and the other began. It simply existed, a remnant of how things once were. The valley watched, indifferent yet witness to the change. Seasons would continue as they always had. Storms would come again. Winters would return. But something durable had settled into the soil alongside the roots and grasses. Something that did not demand attention, yet refused to fade.
By the time the year turned, it was clear that neither of them stood alone anymore. What had started as necessity had become choice. What had grown from caution had become trust. The land did not celebrate this shift, but it carried it forward, holding it steady the way it held rivers, fences, and windmills. Their lives continued not as a dramatic departure from the past, but as a quiet extension of it. Two paths that had run parallel for years now moved forward together, not merged completely, but aligned in purpose and direction. The valley remained wide and open, but it no longer felt empty. And as the windmill turned against a fading sky, their story settled into the land itself, unspoken yet certain, shaped by patience, time, and the courage to remain. If stories like this resonate with you, stories of slow burn connection, quiet strength, and love shaped by the American frontier, consider subscribing to Dust and Devotion Tales. New emotional stories are shared here regularly, waiting to be heard.